The rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, a rhythmic patter that seemed to echo the restless cadence of my thoughts. I stood there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee cradled in my hands, staring out into the gray morning. It wasn't unusual for me to feel this way, this low-grade hum of dissatisfaction, but today it felt sharper, more insistent, like an itch I couldn't scratch no matter how hard I tried. That my name is Alex. And if you asked me then what was wrong, I wouldn't have been able to give you a straight answer. Maybe it was the monotony of life, the same routine day after day, or maybe it was something deeper, something I hadn't dared to confront yet. At 32, I had built a life most people would call comfortable, a steady job as a graphic designer, a cozy apartment on the second floor of a quiet suburban building, and enough friends to fill up my weekends when loneliness crept too close. But comfort isn't always synonymous with happiness. And lately, I've been feeling like I was living someone else's dream instead of chasing my own. That's when I first noticed him. Not really noticed, not in the way your heart skips or your breath catches, but he was there, lingering at the edges of my awareness. His name was Daniel, and he lived 2 doors down from me. We weren't close. We exchanged polite smiles in passing, occasionally nodding hello when our paths crossed in the hallway or parking lot. He was married, which made him untouchable even in thought, so I never let myself dwell on him beyond those fleeting moments of acknowledgement. But today was different. Today, Daniel knocked on my door just as I was about to sit down with my laptop and lose myself in work. When I opened it, he stood there holding a plate covered in foil, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes, and said, "Hey, Alex. My wife baked some cookies last night, and we thought you might want some." It was such a simple gesture, so ordinary, but there was something about the way he said it that stopped me short. His voice was smooth and steady, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep past my defenses without permission. I took the plate, mumbling a thank you, and watched as he lingered for a moment longer than necessary. There was a flicker of hesitation in his expression, as though he wanted to say something more, but decided against it. Then he nodded, turned, and walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne mingling with the crisp air. That I closed the door and leaned back against it, clutching the plate tightly. The cookies smelled amazing, chocolate chip, rich and buttery, but they were the last thing on my mind. Instead, I found myself replaying the brief interaction over and over again, dissecting every word, every movement, searching for meaning where there probably wasn't any. What struck me most wasn't what he said, it was how he looked at me. For those few seconds, it felt like the world outside had faded away, leaving only the two of us suspended in time. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room nursing a glass of wine, I caught myself thinking about Daniel again. This time, I let the thoughts wander, indulging in the curiosity that had been simmering beneath the surface all day. Who was he really? Beneath the polite exterior, beneath the wedding ring glinting on his finger, who was the man who had smiled at me like I mattered? And why did it feel like there was something unspoken between us? The truth was, I didn't know much about him. He and his wife, Emily, had moved into the building about 6 months ago. They kept to themselves for the most part, though Emily sometimes waved cheerfully from their balcony while watering her plants. She seemed nice enough, kind, friendly, the kind of person who radiated warmth wherever she went. And Daniel, well, Daniel was harder pinned down. He was quieter, more reserved, but there was a depth to him that intrigued me. Something about the way he carried himself suggested strength, yet vulnerability too, as if he were guarding a secret he couldn't quite bring himself to share. That as the hours passed, the memory of his visit refused to fade. It lingered in the corners of my mind, coloring everything else with its presence. By the time I finally drifted off to sleep, I realized something unsettling. I wanted to see him again, not because of anything specific he'd done or said, but because of the way he made me feel, alive, curious, achingly aware of my own heartbeat. Little did I know, that desire would set into motion a chain of events I could never have predicted. The next time I saw Daniel, it wasn't by chance. It was late on a Thursday evening, and I had just returned from the grocery store, arms laden with bags of produce and snacks I didn't really need but bought anyway, because it felt like something to do. As I fumbled for my keys outside my apartment door, One of the bags slipped from my grasp, spilling its contents across the tiled floor of the hallway. Apples rolled in every direction, cereal boxes crunched underfoot, and I muttered a string of curses under my breath as I crouched down to clean up the mess. That's when I heard his voice. Calm, steady, unmistakable. "Need a hand?" Before I could respond, Daniel appeared beside me, already scooping up an apple that had nearly reached the staircase. He wore jeans and a plain gray sweater, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing forearms dusted lightly with dark hair. There was no pretense in his offer, no hesitation. He simply knelt there beside me, helping without waiting for permission. "Thanks," I said awkwardly, avoiding eye contact as I gathered the last few items. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation, or maybe it was the fact that he was so close I could smell the faint trace of soap on his skin. Whatever it was, I felt flustered, off balance, like the world had tilted slightly askew. "No problem," he replied easily, handing me the apple he'd retrieved. His fingers brushed mine briefly as I took it, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. I forced myself to meet his gaze, expecting to find amusement or mild annoyance at my clumsiness. But instead, I saw only kindness. Something about that look made my chest tighten. Not unpleasantly, but enough to make me acutely aware of how near he was that we stood there for a moment longer than necessary, neither of us moving, until finally he broke the silence. "You okay? You seem distracted." I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Did I seem distracted? Probably. But admitting it felt dangerous somehow, like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded, though I got the sense he didn't entirely believe me. "Well, if you ever need anything, or if you just want someone to talk to, you know where to find me." The words were casual, almost throwaway, but they landed with surprising weight. For a brief moment, I wondered what it would be like to take him up on that offer, to sit across from him and pour out all the thoughts I kept locked away. But then reality reasserted itself, and I remembered who he was: married, unavailable, completely out of reach. "Thanks," I said again, this time softer. "I'll keep that in mind." He gave me another one of those warm smiles before stepping back, giving me space to unlock my door. "Good night, Alex." "Night," I murmured, watching as he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the building. When I finally stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, exhaling slowly. My heart was racing, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't as if anything significant had happened. We'd barely exchanged 10 sentences. But still, the encounter lingered in my mind long after it ended. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying it over and over again, dissecting every detail. Why had he stopped to help me? Was it truly as simple as neighborly kindness? Or was there something more beneath the surface? And why did his presence affect me so deeply? These questions gnawed at me, pulling me into a spiral of self-doubt and confusion. Part of the problem was that I didn't trust my own feelings. I'd always known I was attracted to men. It wasn't something I struggled with or questioned, but acting on those feelings had never been easy. Growing up, I'd learned to suppress them, to bury them deep where no one could see. Even now, years later, remnants of that conditioning clung to me like shadows, whispering doubts whenever I allowed myself to imagine anything beyond friendship with another man. And Daniel complicated things further. Not only was he married, a fact that should have been enough to extinguish any flicker of attraction, but he also embodied everything I admired yet feared in others. Confidence tempered with vulnerability, strength laced with sensitivity. Being around him stirred emotions I didn't know how to process, making me feel both exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. Still, I couldn't stay away. Over the following weeks, our paths crossed more frequently, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Once, I ran into him while taking out the trash. Another time, we bumped into each other in the lobby as he was heading out to grab coffee. Each encounter left me feeling unsettled, unsure whether I wanted to retreat into solitude or chase after the connection I sensed simmering between us. One particularly memorable interaction occurred during a power outage. A storm had rolled through overnight, knocking out electricity throughout the building. By morning, the hallways were dim and eerily silent, lit only by the pale light filtering through windows. I was sitting on the floor outside my apartment, scrolling aimlessly on my phone in hopes of conserving battery, when Daniel emerged from his unit carrying a flashlight. "Hey," he said, spotting me. "Mind if I join you?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool despite the sudden rush of nerves. "Sure. Looks like we're stuck here for a while." He settled down beside me, angling the flashlight so its beam illuminated the wall in front of us. For a while, neither of us spoke, content to listen to the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of rainwater leaking through the roof. Then, unexpectedly, he broke the silence. "So, what's your story, Alex?" The question caught me off guard. "My story? Yeah, like, who are you when no one's watching? What makes you tick?" He glanced at me sideways, his expression curious but unassuming. "You strike me as someone with layers." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. No one had asked me something like that in years, not genuinely at least. Most people were satisfied with surface-level answers, happy to skim over the complexities rather than dive deeper. But Daniel, he seemed genuinely interested, like he cared about uncovering the truth hidden beneath the facade. "I don't know," I admitted after a pause. "I guess I'm still figuring that out." "That's fair," he said thoughtfully. "Most of us are, aren't we? Just trying to piece together who we're supposed to be." His words resonated with me in a way I hadn't anticipated. They reminded me of my own struggles, the constant tug-of-war between who I wanted to be and who I thought I was expected to be. For a moment, I considered opening up to him, sharing some of the fears and insecurities I carried around like weights. But then I remembered Emily, her bright smile and cheerful demeanor, and guilt washed over me like a tidal wave. "You must have it pretty figured out," I said instead, deflecting the focus onto him. "You've got a great wife, a nice life." He chuckled softly, though there was a hint of sadness in his tone. "Things aren't always as perfect as they seem." Before I could press further, the lights flickered back on, bathing the hallway in artificial brightness. We blinked against the sudden change, laughing awkwardly as we climbed to our feet. "Well, duty calls," Daniel said, gesturing toward his apartment. "Thanks for keeping me company." "Anytime," I replied, though the words felt hollow. As he disappeared behind his door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been on the verge of something profound, something neither of us was quite ready to confront. But even as doubt and fear whispered warnings in my ear, one thing became clear. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't going away anytime soon. The days that followed the power outage felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. It wasn't as if anything monumental had changed. Daniel and I still exchanged polite smiles in passing, still shared the occasional small talk when our paths crossed, but there was an unspoken shift in the air, a subtle current of awareness that hadn't been there before. It was in the way he lingered just a little longer during conversations, his gaze holding mine with quiet intensity. It was in the way my pulse quickened whenever I heard his footsteps approaching, even when logic told me it shouldn't point one Saturday afternoon. I found myself sitting on the balcony of my apartment, nursing a cup of tea and trying to focus on a book I'd been meaning to read for weeks. The sun was warm against my skin, the breeze carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from somewhere nearby. For once, the world felt peaceful, almost serene. That is, until I heard Daniel's voice calling up from below. "Hey, Alex. You busy?" I leaned over the railing to see him standing in the courtyard, dressed casually in a faded t-shirt and jeans, holding what looked like a frisbee. His hair was tousled, his face flushed with exertion, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Oh no," I managed to stammer. "Why?" He grinned, tilting his head back to look at me. "Emily's out running errands, and I thought maybe you'd want to toss this around for a bit. Get some fresh air." The invitation caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to decline, to retreat into the safety of solitude where I wouldn't have to confront the growing tension between us. But another part, the reckless, curious part, was already nodding before I could think better of it. "Sure," I called down, setting my tea aside. "Give me a minute." By the time I made it downstairs, he was waiting for me near the grassy patch at the center of the courtyard, spinning the frisbee absently in one hand. He tossed it lightly into the air as I approached, catching it effortlessly. "Ready?" he asked, his tone teasing but warm. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, forcing a smile despite the nervous flutter in my stomach. We moved to opposite ends of the clearing, the distance between us feeling both comforting and maddeningly inadequate. When he threw the frisbee toward me, I fumbled the catch, nearly dropping it entirely. He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that made my chest tighten, and jogged over to retrieve it. "You okay there?" he teased, handing it back to me. "Or do I need to give you pointers?" "I'm fine," I muttered, though my cheeks burned with embarrassment. "Just out of practice." "Well, lucky for you. I've got plenty of patience." His grin widened, and something about the way he said it, so casual, so confident, made my heart skip a beat. I forced myself to focus on the game, determined not to make a fool of myself again. As we played, the awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by an easy rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Our movements synced without effort, the frisbee arcing through the air like a silent conversation neither of us needed to articulate. At one point, I dove to catch it just as he lunged forward, and we collided mid-stride, stumbling backward into the grass. For a split second, we were tangled together, his hands braced against my shoulders to steady himself, his breath warm against my cheek. "Sorry," he murmured, pulling back quickly, though his eyes lingered on mine for a moment too long. My pulse raced, the memory of his touch lingering even after he stood and offered me a hand up. "No problem," I said, brushing dirt off my jeans as if it would somehow erase the heat rising in my cheeks. "Guess I'm still rusty. Or maybe I'm just too competitive," he joked, tossing the frisbee again to break the tension. We laughed it off, but the moment stayed with me, replaying itself in vivid detail long after we'd called it quits and gone our separate ways. That evening, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me earlier. That flicker of something unspoken, something raw and electric. It terrified me, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Too well. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to push him away. A few nights later, I received a text from Daniel. "Up for some company? Emily's working late, and I could use someone to talk to." My heart leapt at the message, though I tried to play it cool as I typed out a reply. "Sure, come on over." When he arrived, he carried with him a six-pack of beer and a sheepish smile. "Hope you don't mind," he said, holding up the bottles. "Figure we could use a drink or two." "Not at all," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Make yourself comfortable." We ended up on my couch, the beers sweating condensation onto coasters as we talked about everything and nothing. He told me stories about his childhood, growing up in a small town, playing football under Friday night lights, sneaking out with friends to explore abandoned buildings. I listened intently, fascinated by the glimpses of vulnerability beneath his otherwise composed exterior. "And what about you?" he asked eventually, turning the conversation back to me. "What's your story?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Most people only knew the surface-level version of me, the graphic designer who liked coffee and indie films, but Daniel seemed different. With him, I felt seen in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Slowly, haltingly, I began to open up. "I guess I've always been the kind of person who keeps things bottled up," I admitted, tracing the rim of my bottle with my thumb. Growing up, I learned pretty early on that it was easier to blend and then stand out. So I did. I buried the parts of myself that didn't fit, convinced myself they weren't important. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds exhausting." "It was," I said quietly. "Still is sometimes." For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a bridge neither of us dared to cross. Then, softly, he said, "You don't have to hide with me, you know. Whoever you are, whatever you're afraid of, I won't judge you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing away years of fear and self-doubt in an instant. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, though I blinked them away before he could notice. "Thanks," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." We stayed like that for a while, talking late into the night until the beers were gone and the room was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. By the time he left, I felt lighter somehow, as if sharing pieces of myself with him had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Over the next few weeks, our connection deepened in ways I never could have anticipated. There were moments of levity, like the time we attempted to bake cookies together and ended up covered in flour, laughing until our sides hurt, and moments of quiet intimacy, like the evenings we spent sitting side by side on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Each interaction chipped away at the walls I'd built around myself, leaving me exposed and achingly aware of how much I craved his presence. But with that closeness came fear, a gnawing, relentless fear that I was crossing lines I shouldn't, that I was setting myself up for heartbreak. Every time he mentioned Emily, guilt twisted in my gut, reminding me of the boundaries I was dangerously close to blurring. Yet every time he smiled at me, touched my arm, or held my gaze just a little too long, those fears dissolved into something else entirely. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in feeling this pull between us. Hope that maybe, someday, we could find a way to navigate the chaos together. It was a rainy Friday evening when everything changed. The kind of rain that soaked through clothes and plastered hair to foreheads, relentless and unyielding. I had been working late at the office, trying to finish up a project before the weekend, but the storm outside made it impossible to focus. By the time I finally left, the streets were slick with water, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights like shattered mirrors. My umbrella turned inside out within seconds of stepping outside, so I gave up and let the rain drench me as I walked home. When I reached my building, Daniel was waiting for me in the lobby. He stood near the elevator, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined him there. Why would he be standing in the lobby on a night like this? But then he stepped forward, his eyes locking onto mine, and I knew something was different. "You're soaked," he said, his voice low and steady, though there was an edge to it I couldn't quite place. "Come on, let's get you upstairs." I wanted to protest, to tell him I could manage on my own, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was something raw and urgent about it, something that sent a shiver down my spine despite the warmth spreading across my skin from the rain. Without another word, we rode the elevator together in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. Once inside my apartment, I peeled off my jacket and hung it over the back of a chair, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the floor. Daniel followed me in, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Neither of us spoke as I grabbed a towel and dried my face, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows filling the quiet. Finally, he broke the silence. "Alex, we need to talk." The weight of those 4 words hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach tightened, and for a split second, I considered pretending I didn't know what he meant. But the truth was I did. I'd felt it brewing for weeks. The pull between us, the unspoken longing that neither of us had dared to name. And now, standing here in my soggy clothes with water dripping from my hair, I couldn't run from it anymore. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Talk." He hesitated, running a hand through his damp hair. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked unsure, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. Whatever this is between us, it's not going away. No matter how hard I try to ignore it, it's still there. Every time I see you, every time we talk, it's like," he trailed off, shaking his head as if searching for the right words. "Like what?" I prompted, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Like I'm drowning," he admitted, his gaze meeting mine with startling intensity. "And the only thing keeping me afloat is you." The room seemed to tilt slightly, the world narrowing to just the two of us. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, needing space to process what he'd just said. "Daniel, you're married." I reminded him, though the words tasted bitter on my tongue. "You have Emily. You can't—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. "God, Alex, I know. Do you think I don't feel guilty every single day? But I can't keep lying to myself or to her. Not anymore." His confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe him, to trust that what he was saying was real, but fear clawed at the edges of my mind. What if this was all a mistake? What if giving in to these feelings would only lead to pain for both of us? And what happens after tonight? I asked, my voice trembling. What happens when the storm passes and reality sets in? I don't know, he admitted, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his uncertainty. All I know is that I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. I can't keep pretending I don't want you. The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. All the walls I'd built, all the fears I'd buried, they crumbled in an instant, leaving me exposed and achingly aware of how much I wanted him to. Before I could stop myself, I crossed the distance between us, my hands reaching for his face. His skin was cool from the rain, but his eyes burned with heat as they locked onto mine. Are you sure about this? I whispered, my thumb brushing lightly over his cheekbone. Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned into my touch, closing his eyes for a brief moment before pulling me closer. His lips met mine in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and tenderness, sending sparks shooting through my body. It wasn't perfect. Our movements were clumsy, our breathing uneven, but it didn't matter. In that moment, nothing else existed except the two of us. Tangled together in a storm of emotion and desire, we stumbled backward until my back hit the wall, his hands sliding down my arms to grip my wrists gently. His kisses grew deeper, more insistent, each one unraveling me further until I wasn't sure where I ended and he began. Somewhere in the haze of passion, I heard him murmur my name against my lips, his voice rough with need. I've wanted this for so long, he confessed between kisses, his breath hot against my skin. So damn long. So have I admitted, my fingers tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. The admission felt like a release, like letting go of a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to fully embrace the truth. I wanted him, needed him, and I didn't care about the consequences anymore. Today, as the night unfolded, the boundaries we'd carefully maintained dissolved completely. We moved to the bedroom, shedding layers of clothing and metaphorical armor until there was nothing left between us. Every touch, every whispered word, carried the weight of emotions we'd kept hidden for far too long. It wasn't just physical. It was a merging of souls, a collision of two people who had been searching for connection without even realizing it. When it was over, we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the sound of rain still drumming softly against the window. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the enormity of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely audible that I turned to look at him, studying the lines of his face illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through the blinds. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "But whatever happens next, we'll figure it out. Together." He nodded, pulling me closer until our bodies were flush against each other. As sleep began to claim us, I couldn't help but wonder if we were making the biggest mistake of our lives, or taking the first step towards something truly extraordinary. The morning after the storm arrived with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in soft, golden streaks, painting the room in hues of warmth that felt almost cruel given the turmoil brewing inside me. I woke up first, lying on my side and watching Daniel sleep. His face was relaxed, his breathing steady, but even in repose, there was a tension etched into his features, a quiet unease that mirrored my own. For a while, I let myself indulge in the illusion that everything might be okay. That last night had been more than just a fleeting moment of weakness, more than a reckless surrender to emotions we couldn't control. But reality crept in slowly, like frost spreading across glass, until it became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about Emily, about promises broken and lives upended, about the fragile web of trust and loyalty we'd shattered without fully understanding the consequences. When Daniel finally stirred, he blinked awake with a start, his eyes darting around the room before landing on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, softly, he said, "Hey, hey." I replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and fears. Eventually, he sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. We should probably talk. I nodded, though dread coiled tightly in my chest. Talking meant facing the truth, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Not yet. Still, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and grabbed a pair of sweatpants from the floor, pulling them on before sitting cross-legged across from him. What happens now? I asked, echoing his question from the night before. My voice sounded distant, detached, as if someone else were speaking for me. He sighed, rubbing his temples as though trying to ward off a headache. I don't know. This changes everything. For both of us. His words hung in the air, sharp and final. They weren't wrong, but hearing them aloud made my stomach churn. Everything had changed. There was no going back to the way things were before. The polite smiles, the casual conversations, the carefully maintained distance. Whatever bond we'd formed had crossed into dangerous territory, and now we were left to pick up the pieces. Over the next few days, life felt surreal, like walking through a dream where nothing was quite real. Daniel returned to his apartment early that morning, promising to speak with Emily as soon as possible. But each day that passed without news left me increasingly anxious, my mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. What if she found out another way? What if she hated me? Or worse, what if she blamed herself? Meanwhile, guilt gnawed at me relentlessly. I tried to distract myself with work, throwing myself into projects with obsessive focus. But even then, thoughts of Daniel lingered at the edges of my consciousness. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of our encounter, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Then came the knock on my door, a sound so ordinary it shouldn't have sent my heart racing. But when I opened it to find Emily standing there, her expression unreadable, my blood ran cold. "Hi, Alex," she said, her tone clipped but not unfriendly. "Can we talk?" "Of course," I stammered, stepping aside to let her in. She walked past me with measured steps, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Something about her demeanor set off alarm bells in my head, though I couldn't pinpoint why. "I'll get straight to the point," she began once we were seated in my living room. Her gaze locked onto mine, sharp and piercing. "Daniel told me about you too." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at her, my mouth opening and closing uselessly as panic surged through me. "He did." I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. She nodded, her jaw tightening. "Yes," he said. "Well, he said a lot of things. Things I'm still trying to process." She paused, looking down at her hands before continuing. "I need to understand something, Alex. Did you know how serious he was about this? About leaving me before last night?" Her question caught me off guard. "Leaving you?" I repeated, my voice cracking slightly. "He's a leaving?" "He says he is," she replied, her tone tinged with bitterness. "But I don't know what to believe anymore. So I'm asking you, did you encourage him? Did you push him toward this decision?" "No," I exclaimed, shaking my head vehemently. "Emily, I would never, because it feels like betrayal," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Not just because of Daniel, but because of you. We've been neighbors for months, Alex. You've been in our home, shared meals with us. And all this time," she trailed off, shaking her head as tears welled in her eyes. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Her pain was palpable, cutting through me like a knife. I wanted to tell her it wasn't like that I hadn't planned for any of this to happen, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? Instead, I sat there in silence, feeling smaller and more powerless than I ever had in my life. "I'm sorry," I whispered finally, though the apology felt woefully inadequate. "I never meant to hurt you." She studied me for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "I believe you," she said eventually, her voice quieter now. "But that doesn't make this easier. Not for me, and not for him." With that, she stood and walked toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping outside. "Take care of yourself, Alex," she said, glancing back at me one last time. Then she was gone, leaving behind a void filled with regret and uncertainty that I in the days that followed. The fallout rippled outward, touching every corner of my life. Word spread quickly among our small circle of neighbors, fueled by whispers and speculation. Some people avoided me altogether, their judgment clear in the way they averted their eyes or hurried past without saying hello. Others confronted me directly, demanding answers I didn't have. Through it all, I felt like a ghost haunting my own existence, invisible yet painfully exposed. Daniel and I continued to see each other, though cautiously, meeting in secret to avoid drawing more attention. Each encounter was bittersweet, charged with both longing and guilt. He assured me repeatedly that leaving Emily had been his choice, not mine, but the weight of her pain lingered between us, casting a shadow over everything. One evening, as we sat together on my balcony watching the sunset, he turned to me with a look of determination. "We can't keep living like this," he said firmly. "Hiding, pretending. If we're going to make this work, if I'm going to make this work, I need to be honest. With everyone." I nodded, though fear twisted in my gut. Being honest meant risking everything. His reputation, my peace of mind, the fragile connection we'd fought so hard to build. But deep down, I knew he was right. Secrets only festered, growing darker and more toxic with time. If we wanted a future together, we had to face the truth head on. "Okay," I said quietly. "Let's do it. Together." As we held hands under the fading light, I allowed myself a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, love could conquer even the hardest truths. But as the stars began to dot the sky above us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever faced, but they also brought clarity in ways I hadn't anticipated. Daniel kept his promise. He told the truth to everyone who mattered: Emily, his family, our neighbors. It wasn't easy. There were tears, raised voices, and moments when it felt like everything might unravel completely. But through it all, he stood firm, refusing to let fear dictate his choices. Watching him take ownership of his decisions made me realize just how much courage it took to step into the unknown, and how much strength we both needed to navigate it together. Emily handled things with a grace I didn't expect, though her pain was undeniable. She moved out of their shared apartment shortly after their separation became official, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed in the hallways of our building. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of her walking briskly to her car or chatting with another neighbor, her smile polite but distant. Each time, guilt tugged at me, reminding me of the role I'd played in fracturing her life. But she never confronted me again, and eventually, her presence faded from my daily thoughts. Not because I stopped caring, but because I had to focus on what lay ahead. Daniel and I began rebuilding our lives slowly, cautiously, as if testing the ground beneath us for cracks. We found a small apartment on the other side of town, far enough away to escape the whispers, but close enough to remain tethered to the world we knew. Moving in together felt surreal, a mix of excitement and trepidation, but every box we unpacked, every piece of furniture we arranged, brought us closer to something resembling normalcy. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future where happiness wasn't overshadowed by regret. One evening, as we sat on the couch sharing takeout and watching the city lights flicker outside our window, Daniel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. That I paused, chopsticks halfway to my mouth, considering the question. "All the time," I admitted. "But then I think about how different my life is now, how different I am, and I can't imagine going back." He smiled faintly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Me neither. Even with everything we've been through, I wouldn't trade this for anything." His words settled over me like a warm blanket, easing some of the lingering doubts I'd carried for so long. It wasn't that the guilt disappeared entirely. It still surfaced occasionally, especially during quiet moments when my mind wandered, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, I focused on the present, on the man sitting beside me who had chosen me despite the chaos it brought into his life. Over time, I noticed subtle changes within myself. The walls I'd built around my emotions had begun to crumble, replaced by a newfound sense of vulnerability that felt both terrifying and liberating. I learned to trust not only Daniel, but also myself, to believe that I deserved love, even if it came at a cost. And perhaps most importantly, I discovered the power of honesty, not just with others, but with myself. Pretending to be someone I wasn't had kept me safe for years, but it had also kept me trapped. Letting go of that pretense was painful, yes, but was also freeing. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel and I returned to the courtyard where we'd first bonded over a frisbee game. The trees surrounding the space were ablaze with fiery reds and oranges, their leaves crunching underfoot as we walked hand in hand. It felt symbolic somehow, a reminder of how far we'd come since those early days of tentative friendship. "I never thought I'd end up here," I said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "With you, I mean?" "Neither did I," he replied, squeezing my hand gently. "But I'm glad I did." We stopped near the grassy patch where we'd laughed and stumbled and collided, memories flooding back with startling vividness. For a moment, we simply stood there, taking it all in, the colors, the sounds, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. Then softly, Daniel spoke again. I used to think love was supposed to be simple, that if it was real, it wouldn't hurt so much. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly, "now I think maybe the best kind of love is the one that challenges you, the one that forces you to grow, even when it scares you." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate deep within me. Love wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes achingly difficult. But it was also beautiful in its imperfection, a testament to the lengths we'll go to for connection, for belonging. As we left the courtyard and headed home, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude for Daniel, for the journey we'd taken together, and for the person I'd become along the way. Life wasn't without its scars, but those scars told a story of resilience, of choosing to embrace love even when it meant risking everything. And as we stepped through the door of our apartment, the warmth of the space enveloping us like a hug, I realized something important. Happiness wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding someone who made the pain worth it.